If you so choose, you can use sticky learning. Now, what is sticky learning? Sticky learning is all about having the switch dynamically learn MAC addresses, and then once the MAC addresses are dynamically learned, it will convert it into a static type of address, meaning it's going to put the address of that particular device in the running configuration. So what type of issues can we run into in this particular case? Well, once that address is added to the running config, it becomes one of those secure MAC addresses in the table that can't be overridden by another device. So if you have it set for 2 MAC addresses on that port, and 2 are learned, and then all of a sudden you have that user unplug and walk away, and another user plugs in, is that address still in the running configuration that was learned by the sticky feature? Yes, it is. As a result, no new users can connect to that port. So that could be an issue in an environment where users are constantly moving around and changing. You don't really want that static or that sticky feature being utilized. Another issue you might run into is that you forgot to save those addresses that were put in the running config. That's right. Just because they're in the running config doesn't mean they're preserved or saved to NVRAM unless you do a copy running config startup config. Why is that an issue? Well, let's say you have the PCs connected to the ports. You're using the sticky feature. And then all of a sudden the switch gets rebooted. A rogue device caused that to happen. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get their MAC address learned before the legitimate MAC addresses are learned on the switch port. That way they can get access to the network. But because you forgot to save the running config to the startup config when those new MAC addresses were learned dynamically, that malicious user's MAC address is now learned via the sticky feature. And now they are in the running config. And then when the other users try to connect and their MAC addresses are learned, it causes the violation to happen. So you need to copy the running config to the startup config to make sure the legitimate MAC addresses are saved in the NVRAM and can be preserved during a reboot. Let's analyze the sticky learning feature. PC1. Let's type in ipconfig here on PC1, and we'll see from the output of ipconfig that we need ipconfig all, pardon me. That's what we need. Let's do that. ipconfig switch all, that's what we need. The MAC address of PC1 happens to be right here. So 06D6 is the last 4 values. Let's go over to ASW1. And let's look at the output of show run interface fast Ethernet 0/1. We have a statically configured MAC address. Let's remove that. Configure terminal, interface fast Ethernet 0/1, no switch port. Okay. And instead now, let's configure the sticky feature. So what we'll do is we'll type in switch port, port security, MAC address, sticky. So instead of statically defining the MAC address as we had done, we're now going to use the sticky feature instead. So if we look now at the running config, let's be a little more accurate, show run interface fast Ethernet 0/1, we'll see that we've already learned one of the MAC addresses using the sticky feature, 657A. Let's generate a little bit of traffic from PC1. We'll go to PC1, we'll ping the default gateway. So we have access to the default gateway. Go back to ASW1. Let's look at the running config now for fast Ethernet 0/1. There is the MAC address of PC1. So they were successfully learned. And if we look at the output of show port security address, we'll see them listed in the table as secure sticky. Secure sticky. So they were learned via the sticky feature. Or, pardon me, they were learned dynamically, but then put into the running config as permanent addresses using the sticky feature. But they're not technically permanent unless we copy them to the running config. Because if you look at the startup config, copy them to startup config. So let's type in show startup config for interface fast Ethernet 0/1, and we'll see from this output, show startup config. No, so I'll just have to browse through the whole thing. Let's go through it. Fast Ethernet 0/1. All right, so here's the old config I had in the startup config. This is the old static configuration for that interface. But the other MAC address is not in here. So we have to copy that over, or else it's not going to be an NVRAM. And can you sort of see the little issue here that you're running into? It means that every time a new device is added to the network or something changes, these addresses are learned dynamically and then made sticky. Now you have to make sure you do a copy running config startup config to make sure that you save that information to the startup config that was learned during the sticky process. So that's how it works. Keep that in mind. If all of a sudden a device is rebooted and for some reason the sticky MAC addresses are now different than they were before, and you have malicious traffic in your network, it's simply because you forgot to save the running config to the startup config to make sure you preserve the sticky MAC addresses that were learned.